Saket, from what I Saket, from what I understand, you're a Hou Hsiao-hsien connoisseur. So why don't you start the discussion with your initial?
Yeah, Nikhil, I was thinking about this in a funny sense that I didn't want to be known as the guy who attends only when Hou Hsiao-hsien films are streaming. But yeah, I'm a big fan. I would say he's probably my
Hmm.
favorite filmmaker. Um,
Oh,
I guess my initial thoughts. So this was the second time I was watching this. I usually rewatch a lot of his later stuff, but
mhm,
yeah, on a rewatch, this was absolutely delightful, and I guess all of us, to a certain extent, can relate to that feeling of. It might be a very Asian thing of spending summer holidays at your grandparents' house, and
true.
even if the specifics might not appeal to someone or we cannot relate to something event by event, I think the just that feeling of being there and spending time with your grandparents is or at that place is,
Mhm.
I think, very well captured. And yeah, one of the more early kind of milestones for Ho, I guess, before he got into the City of Sadness and the big things, Time to Live and Time to Die.
Yeah. So interestingly, this uh, uh, builds the primary foundation for his coming of age trilogy, Summer of Grandpas and Time to Live and Time to Die and Dust in the Wind. So right after growing up, if I'm not wrong, growing up, Saket, you can correct me here. Right after growing up, Summer at Grandpa's was his very next film, and this was particularly at a time when Taiwan was going through a tumultuous stage of censorship. Right after the censorship was sort of relaxed, and from that point on, you see a gradual transition with his trilogies. You have the National History trilogy, and then you have his much more recent films, out of which Millennium Mambo was one of the curated films. So yes, um, Jeffrey, would you like to go next?
Okay, I just watched this maybe like a day or two back,
Hmm.
and yeah, like I found it very engrossing. It was my first time watching. Watching a whole.
How Shasha.
Uh, yeah, apologies for the for watching up the pronunciation.
That's
It was
fine.
my
It
first
took me
one.
3 months.
Yeah, so it was my first time watch. But yeah, like I found it like I was somehow able to connect almost immediately. You know, it was almost like, I mean, despite the cultural, I mean, there are some cultural differences, obviously, but
Mhm.
like it was almost like watching some episodes of my childhood play out on screen. There is that evocation, right? There was a evocative, or there was this unsentimentality about it that I really appreciated, because it allowed the like it didn't you know um, spoon feed it to us. Usually, children's films tend to, or films featuring children tend to have a lot more subjectivity, right?
Mhm.
The point of view is like maybe even emotions are exaggerated, right? For the sake
Mhm.
of expressing the child's innocence and capturing that drama, and that wasn't there, but it was like the situations for it were there, but it wasn't as like I like that the language or the visual, like the way he expressed it through the making didn't force that on us. It just took us
True.
in for, like, the viewer was naturally led there, right?
True.
uh,
True.
yeah, I'm still thinking about the film. Like I have like I have that feeling lingering in my head.
Mhm.
I'm more keen on listening in on what you guys have to say on this time, because I'm still reliving it. Like if I
Excellent.
could put it in short.
Excellent. Take your time. Meanwhile, Vishal, would you like to go ahead? This was one of Vishal's favorite picks for the curation as well. So thank you, Vishal.
Yeah. I have always felt that this is a criminally underappreciated films in terms of
Absolutely.
films that we talk about when we talk about coming of age.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very excited for members to watch this film and uh, I mean, hopefully comfort the discussion. But even if they don't, then have this relationship with this film because it's a lovely film.
Mm-hmm.
It is definitely his first, in my view, his first masterpiece. Uh,
Absolutely.
and This is also a film with, I think my relation with Hou Hsiao-hsien's cinemas also started with this film because the film that he made before this, Boys of Fenkai, I hope I'm pronouncing it right.
Mm-hmm.
I saw it very recently, but this is the first film of his that I saw.
Okay.
So, uh, I mean, lovely film, and yeah, I'm glad everyone seems to be enjoying it. I hope everyone's enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm. You could relate some of your childhood aspects to that?
No, no, not really, but
No.
not really. But I mean, it
Okay.
works purely as a simple story, right? Like it's a great film, and it works
True.
on that. And It talks about so many things without underlining anything, and
Mm.
it's like it just the story just flows very organically.
True.
So I've seen it multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
I seem to love it much more every time I see these films, and for me it happens very rarely.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, great film. Just and film which so one of Hou Hsiao-hsien's film is probably the Assassins is one of those films which I would say is one of the most beautifully visual films that I've seen on the big screen.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it is very in your face, not in your face, like it's obviously very visually rich film.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing with this film is it's visually rich, but without being in your face. It's there, it's happening. Like everything is happening in the background. You just
True.
have to sit back and relax and enjoy it.
True. 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 It has that sense of minimalism, ingrained within it. True.
Yeah,
So, Anandita, would you like to go next?
Sure. I haven't watched it entirely. I still have 40
Mm-hmm.
minutes to go.
Mm-hmm.
But so far, I've really enjoyed the movie. It
Mm-hmm.
feels so nostalgic. It really takes me back to the times I've spent at my grandparents' house.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, being like, I can totally relate to the little sister,
Mm-hmm.
where the boys and the cousin brothers, they just all go off to do, to just get on to like doing some mischief or just playing around, like literally jumping into the lakes. All of that happened. And I've been asked to send, like, because I was the youngest one as well amongst all my cousins.
Mm-hmm.
I was basically asked to just, just stay back and not like ruin the fun for all the other guys who were there,
Mm-hmm.
all the boys. What I really liked was that there were so many things. Like, for example, the woman who was mentally challenged as well, and how they would just perceive her differently. I
Mm-hmm.
had that exact same story in my grandparents' neighborhood too, where we didn't know anything about her, but we just heard like rumors and stories. We would all make up stories, and we would just, treat somebody differently, but still be curious, to us to see what's happening around.
True.
And one of the things is I was very oblivious as a child. I don't think I paid that much attention to what was happening around.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is that how a lot of these kids they are observing and they are seeing things, and how it's just somehow affecting them in some way. People are probably not taking their word seriously as well. So for me, it just brings back a lot of those memories from my from childhood, especially that moving to a different city itself. I also just realized how easy it was for the kids to just form a group based on like just one connection. Is that I had a toy and I exchanged it for a turtle. Oh, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then you just have like a group of friends for that summer. You're probably
Mm-hmm.
not even going to remember them later. So a lot of those just feel very familiar.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really enjoying it. The first half an hour felt comedic because of how similar experiences, how similar it feels, and how yeah. So I'm really looking forward to finishing the rest. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I think I agree to some of the points that were brought up about how it's not in your face. It's just happening, and every day there's something or the other happening, and it just seems to be very cohesive, and a lot's going on without really being explicitly being told or shown to you. You know, you just have to soak in whichever parts that you relate to.
True. That's interesting. So, take your time and finish the film, and you can probably, come back and forth on your points here. So, Harish, you're new here, and would you like to go next on your thoughts on the film?
I'm sorry, I have actually not seen the film, so it will
Okay.
be. Yeah, I'm just trying to observe because I know I wanted to watch the film. Let me just
Mm-hmm.
watch it today, and then probably I can post my comments, anything on.
Sure, absolutely,
I will
absolutely,
definitely do that for sure.
absolutely, absolutely. So, Varun, would you like to go next in that case? Oh, sorry. Varun's not here. I'm sorry. Arnav, would you like to go ahead? It's been a long time.
Oh yeah, couldn't join for the past few weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So lovely film. I
Mm-hmm.
rewatched it after a long time, 6-7 years
Mm-hmm.
almost. And
Mm-hmm.
fair warning, who is one of my top 5 filmmakers of all time. So of course I love this film.
Mm-hmm.
So my journey with Who actually started with A City of Sadness with his Taiwanese history trilogy. Then I moved on to this trilogy, the Coming of Age trilogy.
Mm-hmm.
And right from that point, I mean, I loved his work. So what strikes me in this film, I mean, on a second watch, is that how whose characteristic style begins to take shape in this film, right? And even before this was probably his fifth or sixth feature, and the one before this I think was Boys from Franquin, right? And uh, the episodic structure, the passage from either country to city or city to country, these kind of themes, and also in whose cinema, right? What film scholars or film theorists refer to as inferential narrative mode, right? Where you know the meaning or the plot in whose films, they are mostly through inference, not through exposition. That
True.
also kind of you can see in this. Those traits are also visible in this film,
True.
right? So it essentially follows the lives of adult characters from a child's very limited point of view.
True.
So
True.
it demands that viewers would make sense of what's on screen, just as the young children are doing in the film, right? So
True.
their passage through this making sense of what is happening around them in the adult world, that also becomes an allegory for the process of gradual understanding which the viewer themselves engages in, right? So that's another aspect of the film. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And one more interesting part is that this can be considered as a precursor to Miyazaki's My Neighbor Totoro, right? I mean, people who have seen it, they might they might understand what I'm saying. The plots are quite similar, and
What
it's
film
said
are you
that
speaking?
Hayao Miyazaki's Studio Ghibli's My
Okay.
Neighbor Totoro.
Mm-hmm.
So that came out in '88. This was '84. And
Mm-hmm.
whose early works was were discovered quite early in Japan. People appreciated him quite early, even before he burst onto the world stage in the festival circuit. So this was kind of an inspiration for Miyazaki as well when he made My Neighbor Totoro.
Interesting. Interesting. So, Viswa, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I was gonna. I don't know if you kind of stole or not stole, but you kind of pointed out the one thing that got me most excited about the movie is just how much of an inspiration this was for My Neighbor Totoro, which I absolutely adore. But I also really enjoyed just kind of the detached storytelling. There's not really a clear narrative early on, and
Mm-hmm.
kind of builds slowly and surely. And it kind of reminded me of like how children tell stories of like they kind of meander here and there, go back and forth, and then eventually, after some time, they get to the point. And so I kind of enjoyed how not only is it from like a child's point of view, but kind of it reminded me of like how listening to a story from a child is like.
Interesting. Fellow Jitsi used the last one.
Yeah, I joined a little bit late,
Oh,
guys. I'm Kritik. Yeah.
okay.
Uh, yeah, I just
No.
managed to finish watching it like just before the call started. So
Mhm.
yeah, it was great to watch these kids, spending the summers and trying to make sense of the world and what the adults are doing.
Mhm.
And I also really appreciated what Jeffrey mentioned about the detached nature of storytelling.
Mhm.
Um, and finally, I just really loved the scenes where both the grandfather and the uncle used him as a kind of intermediate substitute for each other, and that was really touching. That's it.
Okay.
That's
Interesting.
it, Nikhil. By the way, how's the background noise here? I'm outside, right? Is
Sorry?
it too much? How is there too much background noise?
No, you're doing fine. You're doing fine.
Okay, okay.
So, very interesting aspect that Arnav brought up regarding how most of the consequences in the film are projected onto the child, and the viewers are essentially watching the child move around, and they are our source of knowledge as we navigate ourselves through the film. And uh, as it so happens, we had a similar idea about shoe shine as well. So that's a very interesting take on that. I wanted to start with the film itself and then move on to the director and his filmography, and eventually to the nature of uh, new Taiwanese cinema. Um, because since Samarat Grandpas is in a very direct sense considered um, a step into the cinema movement, I thought it might be appropriate for us to explore the Taiwanese cinema movement, the first generation Taiwanese cinema movement, and at least briefly. So, if we considering how the film progresses, we see right on the outset we see a sense of asynchronism with the um, uh, audio and the visuals, which transition but don't really have the sense of parity we usually come to associate with general uh, visual interactions. So this this is a dialectical montage, as Sergei Eisenstein began to call it, and this somehow set the tone for the film. Right on,
And
right on the outset, we see a sense of asynchronism with the. Could you be a bit louder? Sorry. Hello. Hello.
go ahead. Man.
Yeah,
Okay,
I
yeah.
think someone was making a point. I couldn't really notice.
I think what you said was being played back somehow. I don't know. It felt like that to me.
Yep. So I wanted to think about how this, I mean, although seemingly simple montage with a monologue on the beginning and toward the end, helped set the tone for the film. And I also wanted to think about how, um, similar tactics are usually employed by filmmakers to uh, give a similar effect at the beginning of these films. So, do you have any thoughts on it? On how uh, tones of a particular film is set?
uh, yeah, so I, yeah, I always make a note of that, especially, yeah, with House films, that how he has such a good establishing shot, the first one, and
Hmm.
also the last one. But since we're speaking about only the opening, and I don't want to spoil the final shot
Hmm.
if no one has seen it, but yeah, he has such a good sense of like how to put the viewer directly inside whatever he's trying to convey. And it, with just, I think it's just a girl speaking over her graduating or something like that in
So,
this. And yeah, there's again like how, it's just one day before summer and one day before the vacation, and that kind of feeling is really well conveyed. And uh, yeah, something I always note about like host opening scenes, I think even in Millennium Mambo we talked about the opening scene where there is no it's just voiceover and image and sound, but not
mhm,
someone speaking directly to the audience or to
mhm.
other characters. um, so yeah, that's an interesting note I also had actually.
It's um, it seems universal because you see his style transition through cute girl to uh, summer at grandpa's to the uh, uh, second trilogy, national history trilogy.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and on to flowers of Shanghai, assassin. You see a gradual shift in the way he is economic with his shots, the way he uses visual medium to communicate. But the establishing shots seem to be in some sense universal throughout his films. There is not much change as we uh, walk through his filmography.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's one of the few aspects that carried over to his later filmography. There's a
Mhm,
lot of stuff like, for example, the editing. I think you could notice that he gets really, better in establishing a certain rhythm uh,
mhm,
during his later career, that here it's a bit lacking, and he's giving visual information sometimes that the audience might not necessarily need. So yeah, I do
mhm,
agree that the establishing shot that we're talking about is one of the things that's very consistent even in his later films.
mhm. What, in that sense, what do you think he's going for with his establishing shot, outside of setting the tone and giving a sense of premise of the film? What else do you think is going for? Because what he's doing could be done in probably a different way, but he keeps going ahead with the same, uh, 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 you know, uh, it's the same style throughout, throughout his films. So, despite his general style changing, you don't see a change in the establishing shot. What do you think he might be going for?
So the way I've seen always host films is that
Mhm,
he establishes a feel and a world before he establishes characters or a narrative. And
mhm,
I think that's one of the things that is, if you see his later, even Daughter of the Nile, which comes in 87,
mhm,
it's one of the like more moodier films, even more than City of Sadness, if we talk about his early career.
mhm,
And I
mhm,
think that establishing of mood and a feel and a world is probably his most kind of emphasized in all of his films. And I think that's what he is going for when he does this certain establishing shot where it's none of the characters we see actually see throughout the film, and we don't see like a narrative establishment or anything. It's just kind of something in the periphery of the actual narrative and characters, but it still kind of helps ground you or the audience in a certain world that he is making for before going into everything.
Mhm. Interesting. One tiny error from my end. I'm so sorry, Kaivalya. I usually use my phone, so I cannot really notice who's coming and who's going and who's on the call. So I'm so sorry. I forgot to ask your initial reaction on the film.
Yeah, that's all right because like I think Anindita, right? Anindita
Mhm,
said was exactly what I had, like the girl child, female child. She
mhm,
probably had one of the most interesting arc in my opinion,
mhm,
in comparison to the boy. And another thing that I observed that until the boy was himself beaten up by the goons,
mhm,
he, even no matter how grave the situation was, he didn't look as if he shook, like he was
mhm.
not, the impact of the gravity of the situation was not seen on him until obviously he was attacked, and then the whole police got involved in that particular point. Like the kid getting lost, he was not affected that much. Or even her sister was like taken up by the, I mean, he was in fear for a few seconds, but that fear dissipated the moment she was left on the doorstep, and then he was like, okay, nothing happened, right?
Mhm.
And I guess that is very common with kids, right? Kids usually forget this type of things. I mean, as far as the sister part was concerned, I might have not forgotten it so easily, but maybe that was his character. That was how he was trying to go forward. That is my opinion. So yeah, I think that was the only my first impression of the movie. Apart from, yeah, it is very easygoing, and like all other people have mentioned.
Sure, sure. And I'm sorry again.
uh,
Um,
I
and
was
getting back, sorry.
sorry, I have a small note to make about that
Sure,
again.
sure, sure, sure. Go ahead, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So I think Yasujiro Ozu is a good reference point if like you if yeah, I think he's also very big influence on Hou Hsiao-hsien. And uh,
Mhm,
Ozu also has a recurring trick of having a static shot before
mhm.
starting the narrative and everything else. And I think if
True.
you get that reference point, you'll understand like how Ho does kind of a similar thing. And yeah, maybe for anyone who's looking for a reference point there. So,
True. It's also interesting to think about how, for most of these first generation Taiwanese filmmakers or Eastern filmmakers in general, because you have a lot of stylistic similarities with Apachit Pong as well. So you see how there is a strong similarity between the way they make their initial films and Ozu's masterclass period. But they eventually go on to adapt a style of their own, and it would seem like it's far different from what they used to do before, but it would still have in its foundations some of the elements that they grew up with. That's an interesting point, Saket. I mean, what you said, not what I said. I'm not self-congratulating myself, but what
yeah,
you
yeah.
said.
No, I understood. Yeah.
Um, but anyways,
No, even the
anyone,
other
go ahead.
comparisons I feel are very interesting to think about, like how the
Mhm.
East Asian films generally have that thing of establishing, that way. I
True,
guess.
true, true. It mostly seems like they work with medium shots or long shots, and very rarely with close-ups or extreme close-ups.
Yes, yeah.
So, more thoughts on that? More thoughts on why how designs his establishing shots the way he does?
Not me, if you're
Hi.
asking me.
Yeah,
Well, I kind of have another take. I mean, I don't know if it's not a very academic take, but
Mm-hmm.
just my
Mm-hmm.
experience from watching the film. I
Mm-hmm.
think so. Basically, the last day of school is a very common signifier, right, to denote the transition into summer.
Sure.
Like not just in media, but in all of our lives. It's a universal thing, right? No matter like we are Indians, we have no
Mm-hmm.
clue about what Chinese culture is, but we're still able
Mm-hmm.
to hold relate to that, right? When she's speaking
Mm-hmm.
on so I guess it was something like I guess it was something like that. Like that must have been an element that must have, and like you mentioned it, by establishing that world, you're already grounding us in it, right? You're already finding the audience something to like relate to already, right?
Sure.
All of us will have had like it kind of triggers that nostalgic response from us.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's what Ho was trying to do with that montage. I didn't pay much attention to what was actually said, but I'm sure if like on upon further watches, like future watches, I'll be able to connect what she said in that speech with whatever else happened in the movie, with the
Mm-hmm.
in the film. Like about what the summer. I don't remember the specifics. Since I didn't pay much attention to the dialogue as such. It was more like but I'm sure that's something I'm looking forward to.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
I think particularly with a lot of films, I mean, a lot of Yang and Hou Hsiao-hsien's films, uh, we tend to make a personal connection first and then try to extrapolate the technical details of it. It usually
yeah,
demands a second or third viewing.
yeah.
Mhm. So, Arnav, you have any thoughts on that? Thoughts
Yeah,
on
I
this?
mean, it's
Mhm.
it's pretty much along the same lines.
Mhm.
Ozu, of course, was a big influence on the entire movement, and who particularly he also made a tribute film, Cafe Lumiere, right,
Mhm.
for Ozu. So
Mhm.
yeah, Ozu was a big influence. So that part of that stylistic influence is of course there. But
Mhm.
apart from that, I uh, in the other films that I've seen of hers, I don't really think there's a, significant, thread connecting all of the opening shots. I'm not sure if I'm missing anything. So, any examples that you or Saket could
Good
elaborate
men,
on that?
good men, good women,
Hmm.
City of Sadness,
Hmm.
Time to Live, A Time to Die, Dust in the Wind, and Flowers of Shanghai.
I mean,
I'm
in
supposing
what
even
sense
Assassin as well.
you're
Assassin is
connecting
a
them
artist. Mhm.
thematically or
No, these are not thematic
stylistically?
connections, but rather a sense of universality with the way he
Hmm.
structures his opening shots. Nothing more.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
I can also chime in, Arnav, that so what I said was how he establishes a world and a feeling for the movie itself before characters or a narrative. So in that sense,
Hmm.
I think his opening shots are very similar.
Okay, okay, yeah, in that sense, yeah, of course,
Mhm.
yeah. Even if you see, what's that film? Three times, right? It starts with
Mhm.
a shot of the billiard balls,
True.
which side lit
And I
the.
think
I
that
mean,
is probably the only film I've come to notice at least him using a Western song.
yeah.
It's pretty rare with Hou Hsiao-hsien's films as compared to Edward Yang. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, no, nothing to add there.
Mhm. Okay. So, I mean, the point of the question or the point of trying to discuss the establishing shot was trying to uh, see if there are any connections with that or with his films in general, and trying to think about how it might be if there are filmmakers here, how it uh, uh, they might look at establishing shots and how they could probably set the tone and premise of their particular films. Speaking of filmmakers, Vishal, do you have any comments before we proceed?
No. Carry on.
Okay. So since we were also talking about how his earlier films are not really onto our faces, and they have their own subtleties in establishing what needs to be known. And this sort of takes us to the short economy of Hou Hsiao-hsien's films. Um, we can come to notice how he gradually liberalizes himself with using more shots in his films as he proceeds. I think it's right after the um, National History trilogy that he becomes a bit more liberal with inculcating more shots, but I mean, not useless shots, but uh, being a bit more, I mean, liberal with how he employs those shots. Uh, on the contrary, we see Samarat Grandpa's being a minimalist style film. You don't see what is not necessary, and um, usually the juxtapositions go hand in hand. Uh, and given the thematic structure of Samarat Grandpa's, it's mostly the adult world and the projection it has on the child. So it's something that changes throughout his career, and uh, that is one of the stylistic changes he goes through. Could you guys get? I mean, could you folks care to elaborate on uh, the short economy aspect, or and I mean, share your thoughts and comments. Not elaborate. I'm sorry. Share your thoughts and comment on.
Uh, okay, Jeffrey can go ahead. It's fine.
Who's speaking right now? I think Saket.
Uh,
You're not audible.
no, I thought Jeffrey raised his hand, so I thought he wanted to speak. It's okay. I'll go ahead then.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead. He has poor network connection. Go ahead.
Yeah, so yeah, if you I think if you notice the history trilogy, you see a lot of yeah, he's very economical with shots. There are probably lesser shots, and what he basically does is he does this complex mise en scène, which is pretty much absent in his early films, even this
Mhm.
one. I think that's the additional factor that or additional skill he gained with that trilogy in particular. Even Daughter of the Nile, where the shots are held for long, or sometimes he moves his camera, but there is no edit, and he just lets his characters move and speak freely, and so on. And I think if you move further ahead to Flowers of Shanghai or Millennium Mambo, three times he's basically following characters with the camera. So there are no more a lot of static or shots. And yeah, I think that's how I feel his style has evolved over time. He still uses the static shots, but um, he finds more interest in letting the that shot breathe, and a lot of narrative just flesh out in one single shot.
True, true, true.
Actually, if you are a if you are a fan of uh, Ozu, then
Mhm.
short economy comes with the territory. Uh, that is one
Short
thing.
economy comes with the.
With the territory, that's what he did,
Okay.
right?
Mhm.
That was he. So if you've seen the documentary by Wim Wenders, Tokyo Ga,
Mhm.
so his Ozu's later DOP is
Mhm.
interviewed in that documentary, and he ended up asking Ozu, like, why do you only use this 150 mm lens?
Mhm.
And Ozu asked him to see through the eyepiece and said, see, I mean, this is what more do you need? And that's how Ozu saw cinema, right? That's and if there is one thing to learn from him, I mean, there are many things to learn from him, but that is short economy comes with the territory. Also, we need to understand. He started collaborate. Who started collaborating with Mark Lee Ping Bing after this film, and you will see a change in his shot taking
Mhm.
post this one. Because if you look at A Time to Live, A Time to Die, and Dust in the Wind, if we talk about only this trilogy,
Mhm.
um, uh, they are more richly shot than uh, Summer at Grand Pass. I'm not saying it's not well shot, but when you look at those two films, especially the feeling that I got with those two films was he kept on um, uh, spaces evoked emotions in these two films. Uh,
True.
so so that is also, I would say, that is also one of the aspects that we have to keep in mind. He's he shoots visually beautiful films,
Mhm.
but I wouldn't necessarily call him a visual master. Like, for example, you would talk about uh, uh, somebody like Wong Kar-wai, because whoever
Mhm.
Wong Kar-wai works with, the results are the same. But
Mhm.
that's clearly not the case with Hou Hsiao-hsien. No, I'm
Mhm.
not undermining the job that he's done on his films. I'm just saying that aspect is also very important.
Oh.
And Hou Hsiao-hsien, along with the uh, Edward Young, they were big fans of Ozu.
Mhm.
So they it's that is, short economy is a very important lesson that we take away from Ozu. So if we're talking about short economy, that is probably uh, the most important inspiration that they had.
True. That's fair. And since you mentioned um, a difference in his films as a result of his collaborations. What kind of collaborations were you talking about? Were you speaking of the cinematographer and lighting? Since you mentioned visual similarities,
I didn't understand the question.
were you speaking of his collaborations with the cinematographer? Because
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, 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 yeah. Okay, yeah. And to add, not just Yang and Hao Xiaoshen, but also Chen, who made Growing Up. There were, I suppose, five filmmakers who were huge fans of Ozu. Sorry?
There are many
Mhm.
filmmakers
No,
who
I'm speaking
just
particularly of the
fanboys of Ozu.
pioneers of the cinema movement.
Look at the style of their shot taking. There is obvious influence from Ozu.
Mhm. Interesting, interesting. And not to mention the lighting. Uh, and particularly with this film, it didn't really demand a strong contrast in colors, any sense of dramatism, which for the characters. So the lightings were pretty obvious, and it was pretty clear what we are looking at, and most of it was naturally lit throughout.
I
And
had a
go ahead.
doubt regarding that. Like,
Hmm.
I noticed this one thing in this watch. Basically, all the interior shots had like a huge emphasis. Like, I mean, I noticed a pattern with windows in the film.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I was wondering if that had like whether that was just a practical thing, like that was just for the sake of getting naturalistic light in the frame, or whether that had any significance to the story as such. Like whether that was an additional layer to the story. Uh,
It
Are you speaking of metaphors and symbolism?
they, uh,
Yeah, like I'm
Okay,
I'm
I'm
sorry.
not
sort of.
sure.
That was just a clarification. Go ahead,
I'm
Vishal.
not
Yeah,
sure
yeah. I
about
mean,
the practical. I'm not sure about the practical aspects, but he's definitely used it in very interesting ways to frame within frame, and
yeah.
he's divided the screen in multiple spaces on multiple points in the film. So it's probably more a stylistic choice than anything to do with practicality.
Okay.
Because
Because
if you
like
see
yeah.
the film again, there will be multiple. There will be shots where the frame will be divided into two spaces, and nothing's
Hmm.
happening in the other space, and all the action happens in one. So um, uh, it's obviously a stylistic choice that one makes. I'm not really sure whether that's happened throughout the trilogy, but because I don't really remember these films very well, but this has happened in this film.
I can
Okay. I
remember
also.
bits of A Time to Live and A Time to Die, sort of mimicking what you're talking about. And particularly with Dust in the Wind, it was sort of crammed throughout, all in all, in the film, except for the large
What do you mean by
spaces
cramped?
in the studio. Sorry?
What do you mean by cramped?
I mean, they spend most of their time in the city, and the spaces were generally crammed. I mean, they didn't really have much space to wiggle around as compared to the earlier two films.
That's also thematic.
True,
That's
absolutely.
yeah.
So Vishal, like, do you think like whether Wong Kar-wai or like filmmakers like Wong Kar-wai and so on, like I think Wong Kar-wai used a similar frame within a frame approach in The Mood for Love, for instance, right?
Correct, correct.
Was this a direct influence that was Who a direct influence for him as a filmmaker?
As far as I know, Wong was not a huge cinephile. He's
Okay.
actually the reason he's probably such a trailblazer is because he did not see a lot of cinema.
Mhm.
Uh, at least that's what I know. So I am not
Okay.
really sure. Though Dust in the Wind is a film which has really influenced Southeast Asian filmmakers, but
Mhm.
I'm not really sure he had seen this film. But again, In the Mood for Love has the same DOP. So In the Mood for Love has two DOPs. One is
Hmm.
Christopher Doyle, and
Good
one is the
call.
DOP of this film, Mark Lee Pinbing. So
Mhm.
that there might be a case for whatever you're saying.
Okay.
It's possible.
Wow, that's a nice connection. Yeah.
It's possible. It's possible.
Thanks.
So, any more thoughts on the short economy aspect that we were speaking of earlier? And very interesting points, Vishal. I don't think I'll have to repeat myself because uh, you seem to be a very huge fan of Hou Hsiao-hsien, this as the sum of us.
I'm not a huge fan. I'm a fan,
Mhm.
I'm not a huge fan, but I do
Okay.
really appreciate his work. Actually, what
Mhm.
happened was when I started watching cinema, nobody seemed to be talking about how I discovered him
Mhm.
quite late in the day, and I was wondering why did nobody talk about this guy? And then my journey with How started. So I started quite late on him, but and it's not he's not for me he's not the kind of filmmaker who I could grasp on the first attempt.
Mhm.
But over the years, having seen his films a couple of times, I think you follow me on my cinema page, right? So one of
Yeah.
those few filmmakers who has featured twice on my page. So
Mhm.
uh, he's obviously up there. He's I think Arnav said he's one of his five favorite filmmakers. He's considered by many as the greatest and most important living filmmaker, and I can understand
True.
uh, that point of view.
Mhm.
So uh, yeah, I mean, I'm not. I wouldn't say like he's in my top. He's my top five favorite filmmaker, but he's definitely up there. Like there is no arguing about the fact that he's. And I saw some documentary I think wherein he was talking about the fact that he was very unassuming in the way he talked about himself. It seemed like he was still trying to figure out things. So for
Mhm.
someone who's obviously
Yeah.
achieved so much to have that sort of attitude towards films, I think
Very
he
humbling.
I think he himself considers himself less naturally talented than probably somebody like Edward Young.
Uh-huh. Okay.
If I'm not wrong, I think I saw some interview where he himself said, like, I was not as naturally talented as he is, but yeah, there is no doubt. I'm very happy that we could uh, showcase this film and in the
Mhm.
curation. I think we have talked about this. We're both very excited about the fact.
True, true, true. So, if there are no further comments on shot economy and cinematography of film and lighting in particular, and windows, uh, or any thoughts on windows being symbols of something else, we can probably move on to the next. No more comments. I'm sensing um, Kritik,
I
Arnav,
noticed. I
Kaivalya,
noticed about a
Saket, and
band.
Ritva being particularly silent.
I had one more doubt. Like, I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
doubt in the sense, like, I mean, since it's my first time, it
Hmm.
was just something I jotted down after my first watch.
Okay.
The second half, like, I think towards the end when you had some dramatic moments, right, where with the I wouldn't with dramatic moments in the sense with the sister with the arc with the sister and the other woman and
Hmm.
so on. Like, there was like there was a very, like, conscious use of a pan,
Hmm.
like, uh, as of to emphasize the relation between these two characters in that frame. I think I noticed it with him and, like, with the boy and the grandpa, and notably with these two characters, the boy and the grandpa, and the scene where the last scene with the son,
Hmm.
the son and his lover,
Hmm.
where we find out what happened to him after he got bail, and also the scene where the woman is recovering,
Hmm.
and the little child, the sister is asleep beside her.
Hmm.
Uh, so I was wondering if that was also like a conscious choice from his end, conscious choice in the sense whether that was like an emphasis, like it was placed there for the sake for a sake of an emphasis, or you know, was that something that you meant by the term short economy here? Uh,
I think the reason why they revealed the girl later on was because his father was saying no, that if she had a kid, then she wouldn't run around and she would instead take care of that child. So that would be
mhm.
a huge help to me. And then they revealed that she is sleeping around that. So even I thought that maybe they will show something moving forward, but then I guess they didn't show anything else.
Yeah, I found it very poetic the way they sort of, like, brought those two together like that. But yeah, like, no further comments. I'm actually looking forward to learn more about this in future watches.
Hmm.
So this was very illuminating. Thanks, Vishal. Thanks. Thank you.
I think I personally, I mean, that is my view. I would say that this is not a visually flawless film in terms of
Hmm.
style. It's not a
Hmm.
visually flawless film like his other films are, or
Hmm.
going forward. Because, for example, um, I am not really. So if we have to say that this film is from the point of view of a child, let's
Hmm.
say, for example, I'm not really sure that every shot is from the point of view of or the gaze of a child, whoever that.
Hmm.
Hmm.
So this comes from the fact that he was also on the cusp of becoming this great filmmaker. He had not yet reached there. So, but
Could you
from
mention some
here on,
examples for that?
from here on in the films that he did, they
Hmm.
were they were more, in the zone of being flawless compared to this film. This film just works. It just works. It's beautiful. It has many themes, and it does them very beautifully. But I wouldn't call it visually as a flawless film.
Hmm. Could you point out a couple of examples to the film just so we can make a connection.
For example, the one shot that comes to my mind is oh, uh, in the end, right, when
Mm-hmm.
he goes and meets his uncle with his grandfather,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and he leaves, and we still look at his uncle and his uncle's girlfriend or wife,
Mm-hmm.
correct? And he's
Mm-hmm.
still
Yeah.
breathing in pain. So that is not from his point of view. He's left the space. So
True.
you can probably find a few shots wherein that happens. But um, and as we were talking about the pans, at what point did those pans come? I mean, I have to see see the film again and concentrate on those particular shots. But it's very beautifully done. I'm not complaining about it. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's just
Yeah.
that, as I said, once he started collaborating with a different DOP, you can. So if you probably as an exercise, you can see these three films back to back, and you will see the difference. You will
Mm.
find the other two films being much more polished.
True.
Yeah,
Okay,
uh,
I'll do that. Yeah.
just a
I
note on
mean,
cinematography.
go ahead, go ahead.
So yeah, I agree with Vishal in the sense that this is not particularly a highlight, because when you see this film, you cannot, specifically identify this is shot by a certain cinematographer or by a certain filmmaker.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not necessarily bad either. It's just that Ho went on to make some of the most like textured and visually unique films. Like if you watch Flowers of Shanghai, there is no
Mm-hmm.
film that looks like that and feels like that. So I
Mm-hmm.
I do agree to a certain extent that his textures have evolved much more compared to even Young or the other filmmakers of that generation.
Yeah, even I've already mentioned uh, Assassins is one of those films which I could say is one of the most beautiful films I've seen on the big screen.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
And
that's also a good comparison point, because again, Wong Kar-wai after 2046 he made My Blueberry Nights and The Grandmaster. So it's like sometimes I feel like it's not necessarily the cinematographer like you mentioned, but uh,
Hmm.
yeah, it's I think Ho just matured into more textured
correct,
visuals.
correct. That's what I'm saying, right? He was
Mm-hmm.
not the Ho that we know now. He,
Yes, yes.
and you also, as cinema is a game of collaborations. Your work also depends on the kind of people that you collaborate with, right? So
Yeah, yeah, of course, of course.
that also matters.
So all of this kind of proves who right, when he says that he was not really as naturally talented as Yang. So it
Yeah,
took who around seven,
Mm-hmm.
eight films to kind of get into his stride and become the best version of himself as a filmmaker. Whereas
That's true. Mm-hmm.
Young's third film is Taipei Story, right, which is a masterpiece. Then he followed it
True.
up with Terrorizers and Brighter Summer Day, three masterpieces back to back.
and I think this is also, like Arnav rightly pointed out, this is a great lesson for budding filmmakers in the group that
Mm-hmm.
it's okay to not make a Citizen Kane at your first attempt.
Thanks. That was great.
So moving on, um, I particularly with the editing, it. I mean, but in this film, we come to notice how. I mean, since we were talking about cuts, uh, there was one very interesting aspect that I was mesmerized with, and that was the scene where Ting Ting falls on the railway tracks. It if we look at if we can think about a typical film, we usually look at cross-cutting. You have, I mean, this is particularly to build tension, but in this you have a static camera just staring at the railway tracks and not doing anything. And I mean, it sometimes takes us back to the economy of shots, but that was something I wanted to point out.
I think that what you're trying to mention that if it was a typical normal movie, mainstream movie, they would have actually shown the train approaching the girl and stuff
Not
like
just
that.
a mainstream movie, but um, I mean, if the idea was to build tension, uh, it needs to juxtapose two scenarios, just so the audience get a sense of what is happening and uh, how dangerous the situation is eventually getting to be.
Yeah, so Kaivalya, I think Nikhil is talking about like there is no cinema trick there. So what he does is basically have a static shot, and when the girl saves the little sister, the train
Mm.
passes, and there is no edit there. And I noticed that I'm also actually blown away by that. Like
Mhm.
it's something. It just felt like such a risky move for a immature filmmaker, I guess.
I
Yeah,
think
but I think what they did was that if they had shown the train, then the train would have been the imminent danger. But they didn't show the train. The girl has tripped and fallen down, and now this woman, about whom there is already a rumor that she beats everyone, she does this and she does that. So now she's picking her up. Even that builds up a tension, right? Because if you see, even after the train passes away, the boy is still frightened because for the boy, she might have saved her sister, but she is still in danger because she is around a person who is not mentally right there. So even that was
This
a
was not particularly
twist.
from the boy's perspective, but I mean, this was just the mise en scene and how sets up tension in a particular in that particular scene.
I mean, even the audience know that the woman is mad. So why is she picking her up? Even that itself builds up a different layer of tension, na? Until it is revealed that actually a train is coming because we do not even hear the noise of the train coming approaching, right? Even that
Okay.
does not happen. That
Hmm.
also the girl who picks her up and then she
Hmm.
moves away and after in a flash the train comes and now it is revealed that okay there was a train coming through, right? So yeah, I mean, yeah, the timing was obviously very good, but in the editing part also they deliberately didn't kept the sound of a train approaching. So now we do not know why exactly is she picking up. I mean, is she in danger from the woman or is something else is going on? And then they showcase, oh, that was the actual danger because of which the woman helped her. So I think in a way it also like fooled us into believing that the real danger is the mentally challenged woman. And because we do
Uh,
not have any clue about the train approach at that particular moment.
Kaivalya, I think the question was about how that particular action was shot. So if you
Oh,
notice,
yeah,
it
yeah. So
happened in one
yeah, yeah.
single shot.
I might have misunderstood, but that was also a point
Yeah,
that was very interesting.
apparently, like I saw a YouTube comment about this. Like on the YouTube link I watched the film on, and
Hmm.
apparently the girl in that one shot was a male stand-in,
Hmm.
and it was done for real.
Hmm.
That's what I understood. I haven't found anything else about this on the internet or anything, because even I was shocked by it when I saw it. Uh, I was under the assumption that maybe there must have been two tracks, and the one track was just hidden,
Hmm.
and I mean hidden in the sense like just under the frame of view,
Hmm.
and it was just a camera trick or something like that. But this is what I found from the comments. That to a Chinese, that to a I suppose it's the Cantonese comment that I just tra- found the translation for. So
Hmm.
this was the only context frame of reference I have. But yeah, oh my god, what a like it was it was quite something.
True. True. Um, any further comments on that? I mean, any general comments or observations that you want
General
to?
comments on the editing, or
Yeah, particularly in association with this, because I think we spoke a
now
bit more elaborately about cuts and somehow, in some degree, encompasses editing. But there are any additional points that some of you want to make?
okay, not from my side. I didn't really pay much attention
Hmm.
I
to the
felt it was beautifully edited, as in nothing
Hmm.
felt as it was held even for a second more or second less. It,
Hmm.
It has such a beautiful flow in terms of
Hmm.
its. Um, uh, it's I think the reason one of the reasons why we never we never get out of this film is because it it it's it's leisurely edited in terms of pace, but
Hmm.
it feels perfect. It has a the edit has the feeling of how Ozu would shoot his films.
True. But interestingly, you don't. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I'm done. Yeah, go on.
So interestingly, uh, the temporal aspect doesn't really feel constricted. So, yeah, although it's a film that happens throughout summer, but the time frame is probably 1 hour once. I mean, starting from the point uh, the summer starts for them, but you practically feel the time slowly passing ahead, and by the end of the film, uh, in at least from the film perspective, you might have felt uh, a month or two passing by. So it was a very interesting writing trick. Um, in the sense it feels stretched out, but at the same time it's constricted within its film time frame. So I was sort of looking at the writers, how collaborates with, and outside of um, uh, outside of how he treats children in his films, he also has a distinct sense of feminism in his film. So I was wondering how that was the case, and I stumbled upon Tien-wen, who is a fictional writer and also um, a frequent collaborator with Hou Hsiao-hsien. And that sort of brings out a couple of nuances we did. I mean, I think the film connoisseurs and filmmakers and aspiring filmmakers can make a better comment on that. But we usually miss out if they are male writers and directors. They usually miss out on certain nuances that are unique to a woman. But particularly the Hou Hsiao-hsien films, you don't really see that. Any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on why? Any thoughts on if that is a universal case? Or,
Yeah, so I'll be really mad at this, but
Mhm,
I actually saw a Hou Hsiao-hsien interview on YouTube where
mhm,
someone asked him the same question about why do you have female centric films, and I think if you follow a lot of Daughter of the Nile, obviously, Millennium Mambo, and even Flowers of Shanghai to a certain extent is more about women than men,
mhm.
and he answers that, and I just don't remember right now. If I find the link again, I'll probably
I
send
mean,
it below.
this was not to provoke a controversy, but rather trying to explore the very thought of it, very thought of uh, uh, female writers probably bringing in nuance, or I mean, the uh, yes and no's of it.
Yeah, I was about to say that as well. Like he did not mention that directly about Shu Tianwen,
Mhm,
kind of lending in her perspective as a feminine herself. So I'm not sure about that, but I was also thinking about on a rewatch how much the film considers the sister's perspective, and it's kind of in line with what he does later. And I was also reminded of. Ingmar Bergman's Fanny and Alexander, which came out
mhm,
2 years before this, and it's kind of something that has always bugged me that Bergman never considered the sister's little sister in that movie, her
mhm.
perspective. It's more about Alexander in that movie, and I just thought of it, and it's a very interesting point. I myself wanted to know more about it, the feminism angle here, I guess.
From what I've noticed, especially with the Eastern films that have this feminist element in their films, is they are not seen. They're not portrayed as strong characters, but rather characters who are suffering as a result of uh, uh, um an irrational patriarchy, an irrational system. And a lot of what we hear from them seems conditioned. For example, with uh, Time to Live and A Time to Die, we see the old lady speak about how studies are not important for the child, but rather uh, you know, family rearing. Even with Summer at Grandpa's, we see how the uh, grandmother, uh, uh, despite her emotions, overwhelming emotions of possibly losing a child, is the only reason she gives is being a helper, being an extra hand in the goings on in the hospital. I mean, particularly with what's happening with the daughter. This is a strong contrast. I mean, not particularly a strong contrast, but with contrast with the perceptions on the Western and Eastern Hemisphere, and that in some direct or indirect sense has had its influence on, at least from what I've noticed, on Kannada filmmakers as well, Kannada and Bengali and uh, Tamil and Kerala filmmakers as well.
Nikhil, I
Hmm.
just wanted to make a point. Like you mentioned that she's the only reason she gives is that she would be a helping hand.
Hmm.
Now we can see from throughout the movie, though the grandfather himself, is doctor himself, is
Hmm.
he has emotions, but he never shows them, and he's a very rational person, logical person, right? Even then, he was saying that it's no use, any moment we'll get a call. Your going presence over there would not make any sense. It would just create tension and stuff like that. So after living for like 40, 50 years, I'm assuming 40, 50 years, with a man who has this type of logic, you automatically learn how to handle and how to give him something that would satisfy his need of rationalize. Okay, I would just be a helping hand, right? So now even that is also a logical argument, right? You beat logic with logic, you cannot beat logic with emotion, right? So over the years, I think this is very nice thing that I have noticed in a lot of women. They understand that this person is not going to understand this particular way. So let's talk to him in some particular others. Let's give him some other argument that would make sense to him, right? So that is also in a way very good thing. Like over the years, she has learned how to you know
No, I don't
get.
think so. You make it sound like a life hack, but rather it is somehow pushing them down to the same oppressive
So
system.
it's a compromise,
Yeah,
right?
it's essentially a compromise. Yes.
No, but I'm not saying in that manner. I was just saying that over the years, you if you are collaborating with someone or you're living with someone, you know how to handle that person in a particular manner, right? Obviously, I'm not saying that she could have said no, I'm going to go there, and she would have been given the permission. I'm not saying that. Obviously, I'm just saying that over the year you learn how to put your points to a particular person to make them agree with, even temporary, and even the other person also understands. Okay, now she's adamant, it's no use fighting over this, just let her do whatever she wants to do. This type of thing, this type of understanding usually happens, at least in the I have seen in a lot of people. So that was just one point that I was trying to say. I'm not saying that this is exactly the case. I'm just saying even this is a point of view, few things
Uh,
to.
Okay.
I have another take on this. Like,
Hmm.
so I guess this is more of a personal take because I was able to relate to the relationships the grandparents have with the kids in the film. Because it was, I could parallel it with how with my relationship with my grandparents growing up. Meaning that, like, even in the same case, I only saw them like maybe once a year during the summer, and a lot of it tended to, I mean, since there was that lack of familiarity in the sense, uh, you know, small pockets of time across in a year, right, where you get to bond with each other. So naturally, uh, though parents, these parental figures tend to take on the gender, so the gender roles, right? When it comes to when they are around children. Say even if we, like, say you or me, for instance, if we have to look after a child tomorrow, babysit or look after a child, not babysit, even talk to a kid at a party tomorrow, we would. I mean, there are times where we would take on a playful tone or a comforting tone or a strict tone when necessary. If they are restless or whatever. So I guess the grandma and the grandpa here were acting like, because even with respect to my main reference point for this particular observation being the point where the grandfather talks to there's a scene after all the chaos that has happened, after his son has been jailed, after, like, after knowing about the real condition about his daughter, whether, chances of her surviving her operation. the grandfather never the grandfather never has a outburst or a reaction. Instead, we are shown a scene where he's at a landscape with the boy child, and
Mhm.
he talks to him about, and then he goes on a monologue about the importance of family, or the I can't, I'm finding it hard to paraphrase exactly what is mentioned, but it had to do with these themes, right? And the and he says it in a way that the boy is supposed to take these as life lessons, in a matter of fact way. But I could, like, here, this is my take. I could tell that it was more for him than for the child. It was more his way of letting out these anxieties, these emotions, instead of, him finally releasing it to a child who he thinks will or might not, may or may not remember all of it. But the boy doesn't. Like, there's a voiceover that comes right after where he's writing to his mother, like, grandpa told me some stuff, but I didn't understand much of what he was saying. So yeah, and even with the way the grandma, and especially another example being the way the grandmother is towards the girl child. I think she gets treated a lot more, not a lot more, relatively more harshly by the grandparents than the boy. Because, and if you
Mhm.
notice, the boy is the one who's a lot more mischievous throughout the film, right? He's the one who goes to the who goes unsupervised to the lake and swims naked,
Mhm.
loses his clothes somewhere. He gets into a lot more trouble. But we
Mhm.
never see, like, his scoldings aren't as harsh or as hard hitting as the ones we see with the girl.
Mhm.
Granted, even the girl child gets into, similarly, I wouldn't say dangerous. Dangerous is too strong a word, but
Mhm.
mischievous situations. But I don't think, like, magnitude wise, I don't think they compare to the boys, right? But she also gets chastised for it more. Also, her younger age being a bigger factor, right? The boy, we are shown multiple times that the boy knows when to take charge, like,
Mhm.
especially at the start, where the uncle, the the uncle leaves them in the train, leaves him
Mhm.
by accident in the train, and the boy naturally takes in charge. He shows a surprising amount of maturity for his age. He decides to wait there. He takes the decisions there. So that kind of fits into, like, um I mean, you could look at it from a gender perspective, from a feminism I don't know if the feminism angle is that prevalent. I didn't watch I didn't think of it that way, but I could see it.
Not in this
uh,
film particularly, but his
uh,
other films, yes.
yeah, but I could see how that thought would have manifested here. Like, I could see the what if he was trying to make a point about his feminism through this, I could sort of get a idea of what he was trying to do with this. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, I don't know if this was exactly what you were looking for, but this is something that I observed.
No, that's a fair point. That's a fair point. I think for the most part, we can relate to a lot of aspects in the film outside of throwing our cousins and brothers' clothes into the river.
Hmm. Oh, and especially another thing also about the uncle. The
Mhm.
uncle. Uh, so in the scenes where uh, So there's a really funny observation rather. Like he and this is also because of the detached way the film is shot. Like it sort of brought out a funny side, at least to
Mhm,
me.
mhm,
The scenes where we are shown him along just with his girlfriend,
mhm,
the he's shown to be a very proud, or like, he's always vying for her, right? He's constantly vying for her attention, or he's constantly flirting with her, or trying to
true.
impress her. And but the moment she's out of the picture, the moment
Mhm,
he's in a scene with literally anyone else in the whole film, he's humiliated.
mhm,
He's constantly shown, to be this goof up.
mhm,
Uh, and that, I think some of that insecurity also has to do with the kind of people with his upbringing, with the kind of people he's around. His two friends being the two robbers, two thieves in the village.
mhm.
I think the film says a lot about him through his body language, or these small snippets alone. So I found that very fascinating.
Interesting. Interesting. That's a uh, refreshing take, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure, like, you could contrast. I mean, I think there's a lot more there. Like, narratively, you could frame that as like, maybe his dad was like, the problem. Maybe the underlying problem is that his dad was too hard on him growing up, which is why he turned out that way. Or, like, I feel there's a lot more there. I don't know if I could be wrong on this also. Like, maybe on a future watch, I'll come out with a completely different conclusion. But this is what I got from that. Like, the film as a whole regarding what it had to say about gender. Or,
Mhm.
so
Interesting.
I
Any further comments? Any further thoughts on the writing? Okay. Um, so I think we have covered a significant aspect of the film. It would be fair for us to take a look at the director and the cinema movement in brief as well. Before we move on, are there any concluding remarks on the film particularly? Or if there is something that I've missed out? Saket,
uh, I
Anand,
this was the
yeah,
first time I took a lot
go
of
ahead.
notes from
Hmm.
our discussion. So thanks for that,
Oh, no.
especially Vishal, Arnav, Saket, Nikhil. So
Hmm.
I have a lot to go through. I'm looking forward to exploring the rest of the cinematography, rest of his filmography, along
Oh,
with Ozu also. Like, long overdue on that.
absolutely. So, no further comments on the film?
So just
Yeah.
tongue-in-cheek final comment is
Mhm.
it's kind nicely encapsulated in the letters that Tung Tung sends to his mom. Right, he
Yes,
says
yes,
that
yes.
so
Interesting
many
anecdote.
things, yeah, so many things are happening each day that I can't keep
Mhm,
track. I'll tell
mhm.
you later if they come back to my mind. So that's how the spectators feel too.
Absolutely. But since you brought up the aspect of letters, we had a very fair idea of what was going on, but uh, uh, at least from a fundamental minimalist point of view, which was the general nature of the film, would you say the letters were in any direct sense necessary, or would you think that it's a nice addition to establish the innocence of the child? Because it was pretty evident that he was innocent, and he was not really in a mature, his perceptions were not really all that mature to understand what was actually going on.
Yeah, so to me, the letters become a vehicle through which uh, his interpretation of whatever is happening around him is depicted. Right.
Hmm.
So that's how it's being used here. That's my take.
Okay. 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 Saket, Anandita, Kaivalya, Vishal, thoughts on the letters, and or any concluding remarks?
Yeah,
Anandita has been particularly silent. Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I also think the letters are not necessarily exposition in any sense, that like
Mm-hmm.
it's not trying to convey what the boy is feeling. It's
Mm-hmm.
just maybe a little detail to make us understand how overwhelming it feels for him, and just a way to communicate with his parents back in Taipei. So yeah, I don't think there is much there. At the same time, I don't think it's a completely uh, like I don't know, like a worthless thing to have.
But Saket, it does act as an expositional vehicle, but especially when he talks about how she has gotten well uh, after the anesthesia allergy.
Yeah, but I also do think that it's not very direct in
Mm-hmm.
conveying what the boy feels, because obviously the boy doesn't understand a lot of what's going on in the town or village. So yeah, it's kind of vague about it, but yeah, I do understand a little bit of it being exposition, maybe, I guess. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And Anandita, Kaivalya, Vishal.
I'm just enjoying the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I think given that I still have like 40 odd minutes to go, I think I sort of know
Mm-hmm.
what's going to happen towards the end. So
Okay,
I'm
okay.
looking forward
Okay.
to
You can
retrospectively,
probably
like just
put your
understanding.
thoughts on. Sure.
Yeah.
I don't think the letters are so it's because it's such a good screenplay. So every scene is taking the story forward. So that way
Mm-hmm.
the letter is a tool for exposition. But it's actually not a tool for exposition. It's giving us a chance. It's giving us an insight into his thoughts. Also, after he's come to the come to his grandparents' house. I don't remember. I don't think he's talked to his parents at all. So the letters give you an interesting way of him communicating with his parents without
Mm-hmm.
getting any response, because that is also
Mm-hmm.
important, right? That
True.
he's not having any sort of two-way communication with his parents. And in the
True.
end of the letter, he says, "Oh, I'm feeling so tired now. Talk about it later." Right?
Mm-hmm.
So that end of summer ennui that you
Mm-hmm.
feel,
Mm-hmm.
that's probably one of the ways of uh, showing showing it on screen.
Mm-hmm.
And also it automatically becomes poetic, because if I'm not wrong,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we show. Do they show his face? No, I don't remember. When he's
Who's
been when he's writing the letter, do we see his face? Or
once or twice,
In a
yes.
yeah, brief shot, two shots.
correct. So it's it's like a poetic interlude between two actions.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a tool of exposition like every other thing in the film is. So,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not unnecessary. It's a very interesting way of taking, giving information. It's adding texture to the film.
That's fair. That's fair.
I think the only purpose that letter served was first. I mean, obviously, this is my very simplistic take it. Is that first of all, he doesn't understand what exactly is his grandpa trying to do, or that his grandpa also has emotions, but he doesn't show it for some weird reason. Because to him, he is yet to understand that men are not supposed to be one who are crying, right? This
Mm-hmm.
thing, this stereotype has not been drilled into his head till now. And the second thing that he basically used the letter to say is that first of all, he's upset that grandpa's then grandma, despite giving her a promise that she would wake it up, did not wake it up. So it was like first betrayal, sort of like a mini betrayal in a sense that he has had. And he is feeling homesick. He mentions that he is feeling homesick right now. So that was another thing. And another interesting take would be that, in the start of the movie, his friend gives him a phone number, right? One of his school friends he meets at the station. He also gives him a phone number, but he never calls on that phone because he's probably afraid of his grandparent or something like that. So that was also one interesting tidbit that I had completely forgotten about. But once the letter came in, oh, why was he writing that? Oh yes, his mother has told him not to call. Oh, his friend also wanted him to call, but he didn't. So that's something that I remembered out of blue, right? Yeah, I think about that's about it. I honestly feel that the letter did only two things. That first, he's getting bored now. His summer holidays are over, and he just wants to return to his normal life. And the second, that yeah, his grandparent is his grandfather for some weird reason is not expresses what he's doing for his kid. He always hides it, and he never show his kid, oh, I am also doing this, or show that yeah, I am also doing this. He's a silent type of person.
So
Mm-hmm.
when you when you say that a filmmaker is influenced by Ozu,
Mm-hmm.
there is short economy, yes, and another thing that happens in Ozu's films is ellipsis. So
True.
story points happen off screen.
Mm-hmm.
So that letter also helps in that aspect, right? It is giving you information which doesn't play out on the screen.
That's true. That's true. I mean, house. A lot of house films are elliptical with the writing. That's true. That's an interesting observation.
Yes, as I said, right? Like that is one of the major influences of from you take from Ozu.
True.
Like
True.
uh, great storytelling can happen even with the use of ellipsis.
Mm.
And having said that, like it's very rare for filmmakers to use this tool in filmmaking.
True. Yeah. I mean, we have seen a lot of Eastern filmmakers build exposition brilliantly with some of the unique, some very unique tools. But at the same time, we have seen a lot of filmmakers, use lazy exposition with either of the protagonists or the side actors probably explaining something that needs to be explained to the audience. But I think that is usually the case with mainstream films. I'm not sure if that is a general distinction between Western and Eastern. But anyways, and since we were talking about the Western and Eastern distinction, we can probably get back to that. Get back to a particular point. Uh, uh, we kept coming back to when we were talking about cinema movement. But before we do that, any further comments on stylistic observations of the director outside of elliptical screenwriting, improvisations, and I'm supposing his mise en scene is very detail oriented, to the point where I noticed someone point out how in Good Men and Good Women, the protagonist, the female protagonists, gets intoxicated with uh, weed, I suppose, or crack pot. I mean, crack cocaine. Not entirely sure which are smokable and which are intravenous. And outside of being detail oriented, he has a strong sense of landscape aesthetics, which doesn't again becomes a universal element in his films with various texturings, as some of you mentioned. But outside of that, are there any characteristics in Hou Hsiao-hsien's films that you want to point out?
Um, I think we've pretty much discussed all of the stylistic aspects. Just thematically, in this film, right, there are a couple of little things. So first is the interplay between city and countryside, right? That immediately is brought into the film when they sort of alight from the train and they start waiting for their uncle, right? And at the
Mm-hmm.
end, Tung Tung ends up exchanging his car for a turtle. So
Mm-hmm.
that's that's a thematic point that gets brought up at that point, and that's something. So at that point in Taiwanese cinema, right, what was happening, and even in Hong Kong, right, mostly
Mm-hmm.
mainstream cinema was very urban. Nobody was
Mm-hmm.
telling any semi-urban or rural stories. So that's a point to note. And also another theme is a new generation's connection to its older generation, where the interactions
Hmm.
between Tung Tung Ting Ting and the grandparents. That's
Hmm.
another that's another theme which is also present in Boys from Fenkui, actually, right?
Voice and
So
Frank.
yeah, and yeah, apart from that, so these dichotomies between past, future, past generation, future generation, or country and city,
Hmm.
these are not really in contention with each other in these films. They are more in dialogue with each other. So that's a nice way of looking at it. And apart from that, I
The
love
urban
how,
rural divide you're speaking of, I
yeah,
think
I mean,
it
a
it
boy
has
from,
a okay. It has a weird dichotomy in Dust in the Wind. The
yeah.
couple, the rural couple, moving to an urban scape and completely disillusioned by what was happening over there. And
I'm specifically talking about this film. So yeah.
okay, so
Mhm. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And one more thing was what I love is how the tone kind of shifts throughout the film. It starts as a very light film in a very bucolic setting, right? A
mhm,
boy enjoying his summer vacation with his grandparents in a very idyllic countryside.
mhm,
And then it's, things start to happen, right? A lot of things happen, adult activities or stark realities of adult life sort of interrupts this idyllic childhood, and it
mhm.
sort of ends as in an elegiac tone or in a form of a foreboding that almost the best part of their lives are over. This is it. Playtime is over.
True, true.
I I feel like it's yeah, just a small note that I feel
Mhm,
like it's hard to grasp what Ho would do later on from this film itself.
mhm,
So I'd refrain from saying some things like visually interesting or even the mise en scène. I feel like he becomes better with Dust in the Wind than later films.
mhm,
So right now, I don't think there's much here. I mean, obviously there are no close-ups, and he goes for mostly medium wide shots, not
mhm,
even extreme wides, and
mhm.
yeah, not nothing much.
It's actually interesting how he structures uh, the entire screenplay of Flowers in Shanghai, and that film is very different from the entirety of his filmography. It mimics a play in a very direct sense. Even with the establishing shot, it sets the tone quite like a play, and the break in the scenes and the chapters um, probably isn't. I mean, it seemed very distinct uh, in relation to all his other films.
Yeah, I agree. There are pretty much, yeah, there is nothing exterior in that movie. Like everything is shot interior, and it
True.
feels like, and that's such an interesting point too, because
Mhm.
as much as it feels like a stage play, it also feels like the most cinematic thing he has made.
True. True.
Yeah.
And I mean, if there are no further comments on the director, we can probably just very briefly look at the cinema moment because Summer at Grandpa's like a lot of film, like a lot of uh, prime films in a cinema moment are is seen as an impromptu precursor. Although there were a lot of other films, but it's seen as an impromptu precursor. Uh, outside of it, I mean, outside of Sandwich Man being the instigator of the movement. Okay. Um, Arnav brought up how there was a strong need to a strong need to move away from commercial cinema and talk about the rural and semi-urban lives. And Sandwich Man, which was a collaboration of short films, uh, particularly speaks on that. uh, for those of you who have watched Sandwich Man, you get a sense of how Shaoshan builds his builds his scenes, and that is in relation to other directors. But with growing up and Summer at Grandpa's and what was Yang's first film? I don't seem to remember.
That Day at the Beach.
That Day at the Beach. Thank you. And you have, um, a different sense of take on how the films evolved throughout time. But what particular characteristics of the film movement could you think of? I mean, holding Summer at Grandpa's against the cinema movement. What uh, particular elements in the film could you think of? Should I make a more concise point?
Yeah, sure, sure.
So, given how the film played out and the general nature of films, particularly with the first generation film movement, uh, can you think of particular characteristics uh, which was a general element throughout the movement? For example, similarity between Yang's Taipei story and Hou Hsiao-hsien's um, Dust in the Wind, or Kwame,
Yeah.
and films like that. The first generation uh, uh, new cinema movement.
So I think a lot of people point towards uh, youth
Mhm.
in general, but there is also the idea of Taiwan itself transitioning into a capitalistic sort of more inclination, capitalistic inclination, and that transition leaving behind a generation of people who could not uh, really adapt that quickly. I think Taipei story is also a great example that captures that really well. You see these big buildings, and but people are kind of trying really hard to keep up with so much of like economy and everything moving so fast that people are
Mhm.
left behind, and their yeah, relations are left behind, I guess.
There also seems to be a straightforward dichotomy between how Shaoxian builds his films and how Edward Yang builds his films, because Edward Yang's cityscape doesn't really look dystopian as compared to how Shaoxian. Uh, he seems to have a more optimistic view with his uh, uh, you know cityscape and urban living. Granted that he grew up in a city, but he has a far more optimistic view.
Are you referring to Yang being more optimistic?
Yeah, Yang being more optimistic
Hmm.
with the cityscape, because it is a general notion that most of these filmmakers uh, structure the story in a way that the protagonists move to an urban scape, but they're with hopes and dreams, but they are frightened or disillusioned by what is going on out
Yeah, I agree. That I think that
there.
feeling is common. But I've never quite paid attention to maybe agree with you completely that
Mhm.
Yang's films are not films, but his urban scapes are more, I guess, optimistic leaning. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of like elaborated thoughts.
Okay, okay. Arnav, Vishal, Kaivalya, Jeffrey.
I don't really have much to add because I don't have much exposure to Young's films either, apart
Hmm.
from E, I suppose.
Hmm.
But I would love to know more about the context in which Poe's films and Young's films are made. That is, you mentioned something in the beginning, right, regarding Taiwan's politics at the time.
Hmm.
So, any like, could you elaborate on that, or like, something else
So
looking?
right after, I mean, the cinema history starts with Japan's occupation, and right after the independence, I mean, from Japan, there was a push to disregard Japanese films from being outside of Taiwanese films, and Taiwanese films had a very distinct setting, but it was not really the films that you come to notice right now. It had it was a typical commercial film when it started out, and I suppose it had just two or three theaters for the most part, scattered around capital. It the Taiwanese new cinema movement started out in the 1980s, and this was and there was about um, 30 years of gap between uh, the films that were made before and the new cinema movement, and this was particularly because of censorship, owing to something that was akin to the Red Scare in the United States,
Mm,
being so close to China.
mm.
There was strong censorship in Taiwan, and this was the film movement briefly followed after the relaxation of the censorship. And interestingly, this was not the first generation cinema movement. I mean, this is not the only cinema, but it was followed by a second generation film movement, which was mostly spearheaded by Ang Lee and Tsai Ming-ling.
That was like what, a decade later, 90s, mid 90s, right?
Not really. There was not much gap because Tsai Ming-ling was a second generation Taiwanese filmmaker. I mean,
Okay.
uh, particularly within the context of the cinema movement.
Okay. So, what did the second movement entail? Like, what is this? Was like, what is the themes about? What's the stylistic, contribution?
So, from what I've noticed, and I think Arnav and Saket will have a much bigger supplement here.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, and like, it's okay if, I mean, I don't know if this should be its own conversation or anything like that. Like, so feel free to block me there. Uh, but yeah,
so,
you think.
so um, the second generation mostly dealt with I mean, urban spaces in particular. I mean, Tsai Ming-ling uh, with his Vive l'Amour and um, two more films. There was one particular film where the protagonist had some issue with the head. I can't recall the name.
The River.
The River, and another film with the same set of characters, with a slightly different story where he spends his tuition fee on something else.
Yeah, I think that's Simon Lang's first movie, Rebels of the Neon God.
Rebels of the Neon God. Thank you. So these films, particularly talking about Simon Lake, his films explored the, in a sense, a dystopian nature of what Taiwan has become from what it was presumed to be. And this is where I felt Edward Yang had a more optimistic view on the cityscape than uh, his contemporaries. And even Stan Lies, the Peach Blossom Land. Uh, I mean, they go on to become some kind of tragic comedies or a parody of some sort, especially with Rebels of a Neon God and uh, The River, and even the Peach Blossom Land.
Okay.
But interestingly, Ang Lee has had a very different tone to set. Although Eat, Drink, Man, Woman and the Wedding Banquet had a slightly Taiwanese tone to it, but not really. It didn't really feel natural considering his predecessors and his contemporaries at the time. He seemed like He was an American who was trying to direct a Taiwanese film.
Okay, more exoticized or something like
Yeah,
those- yeah, that makes sense. Okay, eat, drink, man, woman, crouching tiger, right? I mean, and those the films
I
of
haven't
that
watched
realm.
Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon to make a strong comment on it, but Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, The Wedding Banquet, Pushing Hands,
Hmm.
these were his earlier films.
Yeah.
And furthermore, you had Brokeback Mountain and Life of Pi, which were essentially international films.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
Nice.
if I had to maybe briefly put it,
Hmm.
I think Ho and Yang captured what it feels like to be in the transition period of a country towards capitalism, and
Hmm.
Simon Lang and Koi Chen and other filmmakers who were the second generation capture basically post transition period.
True. It's interesting how most of them had a very negative view on what Taiwan has become.
That's something. Yeah, I do feel like sometimes maybe Simon Lang's films, especially being categorized about just being about isolation or loneliness, is kind of
Hmm.
narrow-minded. But
Hmm.
yeah, I do get the feeling that Sai does not particularly have a very optimistic outlook,
True.
because even the humor is very dark, actually.
True, true. But it's also interesting to think about how the second generation filmmakers were the one who mostly explored tragic comedies and parodies and dark comedy. And it was not the case with the first generation filmmakers.
Yeah, there is pretty much no comedy in. I think Yang has a film. I forget the name. Confessions. No,
Confessions of a yeah,
yeah,
The Confession, yeah.
confusion. Yeah.
yeah. I think that. Yeah, I'm not familiar with it, but that I heard that one's a comedy. But I don't know if the others. At least Ho doesn't have anything funny.
That was satirical, but I mean, not a very strong distinction in this case. But yeah, that was satirical, but these were essentially parodies of a direct sense, which is what I felt, at least with the second generation. Yeah.
Okay, I just heard that it's funny, so I don't actually know about it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
just yeah, I was just assuming.
Okay.
Okay.
So, Anna, thoughts?
Yeah, so the Taiwanese new wave as a whole, right? So as with any new wave, right, the defining characteristics are, films which are more realistic, more down to earth, more, down to earth or sympathetic portrayals of actual
Hmm.
Taiwanese life and all of that.
Hmm.
So that's there in every new wave, right? So historically speaking, right, uh, in the years preceding the new wave, right, in the late 70s, early 80s, right,
Hmm.
um, Taiwanese cinema was completely mainstream, commercially oriented filmmaking,
Hmm.
right? And Hong Kong film industry used to treat Taiwan as a short market, right? Whatever they sell there
True.
will sell
True.
without questions asked, right? Every
Mhm.
Bruce Lee film went there and became a box office hit and all of that. And martial art films, wuxia films, all of those
Yeah.
used to dominate the market at that point of time. And so that was one part of it, Hong Kong's influence on the market as a whole. And the other point was that they had a monopoly in terms of film studio, right? They had CMPC,
Hmm.
Central Motion Picture Corporation, which was a state-owned
Hmm.
corporation, like our NFTC. Uh, so that was a monopoly, right? So the entire cinematic landscape was dominated by that studio. If you had to make a film, you had to go through them. There was no other option, right? And and of course they played it safe. They bankrolled only the type of films that they wanted to, which were in line with the ideologies of the state and all of that.
Hmm.
And and it also produced a lot of patriotic films which glorified the government and all of that, right?
True.
And state-sponsored realism, quote unquote, that kind of film, like we see from NFDC as well, that kind of thing.
True.
So And also at that point of time, Taiwan was a one-party state, right? The ruling party was
Mm.
the only party, authoritarian party, the Kuomintang, right, KMT. And as you mentioned already, a strict system of censorship was already in place. And it was in this decade, in the 1980s, that this was being relaxed somewhat progressively.
Mm. Mm.
So that's what created that climate for the new wave to come in and flourish here. Right? So, you know, even before someone or anyone denoted this as a new wave, right? They were, I
Mm.
mean, the term Taiwanese new wave came into vogue only after, let's say, 1986 or 87. At that point of time, before that, they were just films being made. Nobody was talking
I
about a
think
new
that is
wave
generally
happening.
the case with a lot
Yeah,
of film movements. Yeah.
yeah. So in 87, I think, if I'm not wrong, or 86, somewhere around that,
Mm.
this group of filmmakers, around 50 filmmakers, and of course they were being led by Hu and Yang. They signed a manifesto, right, which was published in two Mandarin periodicals at that point of time, two of the main periodicals, right. This was the Taiwan Cinema Manifesto,
Mm.
right, which kind of articulated all of their concerns, their thematic, you know, interests, and all of that. So
Mhm.
they uh, basically talked about three things, right? They first was the criticism of the government for its policies towards filmmaking, what they were doing, that they were, interested in promoting mostly propaganda or commercial filmmaking, rather than actual good cinema. Uh, and also they were also criticizing their mass media at that point of time. They didn't treat cinema seriously. It was like a frivolous thing. It was not a part of culture, quote unquote.
Sure. Mm.
And and they were also criticizing the film critics, right.
Mhm.
What they said, that the critics were just playing along with whatever was being dished out to them. They were not really uh, they're not really doing anything for Taiwanese or new cinema to flourish, because critics always have a big role to play in any film movement to flourish, right.
True.
Right,
Mm.
from the French New Wave, we
Andre
have seen,
Bazin. Mm.
yeah, and Kayasu cinema, the entire cabal of writers.
Mm.
uh, so yeah, I mean, talking of Kayasu cinema, right. So another recommendation here, Olivier Assayas, who was, of course, one of the writers of Kayas, he has a
Mhm.
film on Who, right? Triple H, HHH, it's called.
Mhm.
Everybody who is interested should actually watch that. It's a documentary.
Could
It's called
you
A
share
Portrait of.
the link on the group as well?
Yeah, I'll do that. So, I kind of digress. What was it talking about? Yeah. So, so he was also. They were also attacking the film critics. So these were the
Mhm.
three main things in the manifesto.
Mhm.
So then, yeah, that's how it kind of got crystallized into a movement as such. But before they wrote this as a joint group of 50 filmmakers, nobody actually called them a new wave. It was after
True.
that people started talking about it as a new wave.
Mhm. Are there any characteristics outside of what we already spoke about you have in mind?
No, these were the defining characteristics. Like with any new wave, right? All new waves are kind of similar when you talk about it, because
Mhm.
they come out of arise out of similar frustrations being felt by the youth at that point of time. So I kind of feel like all new wave films or new waves are similar in nature. I mean, of
Interesting.
course, they have different features as they
Cultural
continue to
similarities.
bloom. Yeah, but
Mhm.
initially when they start out, they are all similar, or the reasons why they start out are all similar.
Mhm.
Um, that's been there from Italian neorealism. Last week, I think you guys were discussing Shushan, right? Even
True.
neorealism, came out of similar concerns.
Mm.
Then your French New Wave, your Czech New Wave, your Yugoslav Black Wave, everything.
Mm.
Even the German New Cinema, your Fassbinder and all of that.
Mm.
Uh, yeah, that's pretty much it. And all of this, ultimately led to international acclaim, festival recognition. So, uh,
There
City of
was
Sadness
one.
was. Mhm.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, City of Sadness was in when '89, I guess, right? It won the Golden Lion, and then
Mm.
Puppet Master also won at Cannes, probably the jury prize or some other, if not the Palme d'Or. Uh,
Mm.
Brighter Summer Day won a lot of awards, so that's how it, kind of got popularized in world cinema. People started taking notice of this as a movement.
And needlessly, needlessly to say, they won a lot of golden horses as well.
Yeah.
Mm. So there was one interesting aspect uh, that I came to notice, especially with the Western and Eastern divide. There is a strong cultural influence of psychoanalysis on the Western part of the world than the Eastern part. You don't really have them being a direct influence within the story,
Hmm.
especially when especially when they're writing about dreams or character build. We rarely see the Oedipus complex play out in a direct or indirect way.
Yeah, psychoanalysis as a phenomenon, it's very Eurocentric, right? So
Eurocentric trope.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
So
just a point I want to make. Yeah. Mm.
mm,
So I think we covered a lot of ground, particularly with the cinema movement and film in particular. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Can you elaborate on that last point? The angle about psychoanalysis in Eastern and Western cinema. I mean, the lack
So
of it in Eastern cinema.
it's essentially the cultural divide, like Anna pointed out, but uh, especially with the way dreams are written in the Western part of, I mean, the European and European influence cinema, and on the Eastern side, you don't really have the strong influence of it, even with the
Mm.
foundation elements like the um, Oedipus complex or the reverse Oedipus complex, which is recently popular. From what I
Um,
understand, Alejandro Jodorowsky
hmm.
employs it very strongly in his films, and I've come to notice even Ingmar Bergman having that as a crucial element in his films. But that is not the case with a lot of Eastern films.
Okay. I mean, I only have the context of Indian films, and I've noticed it particularly in the 80s Malayalam parallel films.
Hmm.
Like,
I mean, I
but
cannot really elaborate more on that because I'm not well
yeah.
versed with psychoanalysis. It's just the aspects that I can notice that I pointed out.
Okay. Well, like, can I just give a suggestion then? Like, so
Go
there's
ahead.
this film called Swapna Nadagam.
Hmm.
So that's a psychodrama. It has a character. It features a character. I mean, I think it was one of the first Indian films to realistically portray how psychoanalysis and how hallucinations happen.
Hmm.
So the main character is a guy who suffers an accident. So he's stuck in bed, and
Hmm.
it's about how it's about him confronting the various like various different relationships in his life. It was more and well, I think it was one of the foremost examples that came to my mind just now when you brought this up. So
Okay.
yeah, I'll put a link in the group.
Sure. The one Malayalam film that I've come to notice which dealt with psychoanalysis was Deemer's Threads by Vipin Vijay.
Yeah, that's a recent example. No, like I
That's the
think
recent example
last
from
decade, right? Yeah.
mm,
This
2010.
was this, yeah, this is 1970s. I think the first
Oh, okay.
FDI, one of the first FDI batch products. So
Oh, okay. In that
I
case, can
think
you share the film in the group?
yeah, I'll share it in the group.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if like I think I just want more context on this whether we're talking about the same thing. So maybe
Uh-huh.
you could maybe we could continue this conversation in the group itself.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
So I think we covered a lot of ground on in terms of cinema history and cinema movement, the director and film. If there are any uh, final concluding remarks that you want to share before we end the discussion, please go ahead. No. Mhm.
Nothing in particular. Like this was very illuminating. This was a very illuminating conversation for me because I'm new to. It was all new for me, so I had a lot to learn. Like I I ended up taking notes halfway through the discussion. So
Okay.
uh, yeah, this was great. Thanks for all your insights shared.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Arnav. Thank you, Sake. Thank you, Kaivalya, and the others who had to leave before the conclude. I mean, the conversation concluded. Thank you to all of you as well. I think we can probably close the discussion right now.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks a lot.